G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.8, After the Temple Part 2, The Christians. In this and the following episodes, I want to follow the evolution of Christianity between the Great Revolt of the year 66 and the Bar Kokhba insurrection 2 generations later in 132. Let's call it the interwar period. I have a spiffing printable timeline on my website www.historyinthebible.com. You may have heard that all the books of the New Testament are written in the 3 decades after the death of Jesus, and certainly before the Great Revolt. Here I shall ride on the coattails of modern scholarship. Modern scholars accept that the 7 real letters of Paul, and perhaps the Gospel of Mark, were written before the Great Revolt. All the other books were written between the Great Revolt and the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The only New Testament book that may have been written after the Bar Kokhba revolt is 2 Peter. The interwar period saw many others write books. The Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Apocalypse of Peter, amongst others. None of them made it into the New Testament, although some came very close indeed. I'll get to them later. This is the era in which the apostles died, and the early travelling preachers, such as Paul, disappeared. The little Jesus clubs slowly transformed from fraternal and informal organisations into structured franchises. This is also the age in which women faded from view as authority figures. The Gospels give striking and unexpected prominence to the presence of women at Jesus' death and resurrection. For more on that, rewind to episode 2.47, The Resurrection. Paul's genuine letters, written in the 50s and early 60s, are joyous in applauding the importance of women. Paul mentions many by name: Priscilla, Julia, Phoebe, Euodia, Chloe. He refers to one Junia as an apostle, the one woman granted that title in the New Testament. From Paul's evidence, women were respected and important leaders in the clubs that he founded. That may seem surprising in a society so misogynistic as Imperial Rome, let alone Judean society. In antiquity, most people did not think of men and women as 2 sides of the one coin, but as different in degree. Women were the lesser for biological reasons. They were humans who had only partially matured in the womb. They were embryos who had failed to grow a penis. Right. By their very nature, women were the weaker sex. Women who sought to exercise public authority over men were thought to be unnatural. When women did achieve power, they were often viewed suspiciously and maligned for not knowing their place, for not being real women. So nothing much has changed in 2,000 years. Then how did Paul's female converts become so prominent? Because Paul's little clubs gathered in private homes, not in public institutions such as temples or synagogues. The household was the woman's domain. Yes, the husband was lord of all he surveyed, but he spent his days at work or in the fields. If he was rich, he would be invested in public affairs. His wife spent her time running the domestic economy, maintaining the hearth, buying and preparing food, having babies, raising the kids. If her husband was wealthy, she also had to keep the slaves in line. The household was the woman's domain. Most men gave their wives free rein within its confines. That the Jesus clubs met in a private home rather than a public place like a synagogue enabled women to speak their minds. After all, they ran the joint. There are some striking resemblances to the salons of Enlightenment France. During the interwar period, women's roles were curtailed. Aghast at Paul's happy acceptance of strong women, someone manufactured a set of letters, the forger attributed to the long-dead apostle. These letters were the pastorals, written to Timothy and to Titus. For more on them, hearken back to episode 2.52, The Many Puzzles of Paul's Epistles. The pastoral letters reject everything that Paul says in his authentic letters. They relegate women to mute ciphers. As the Jesus movement grew, it moved out of the household and into the public realm, dominated by men. Women were to stay at home as was natural for them. They were to be submissive in all things to their husbands. They were to bear children and fulfill their functions as the weaker and less perfect members of humanity. We have a good amount of information about the Jesus clubs up until the eve of the Great Revolt, thanks to the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. We have far less information about the interwar period. Paul establishes that Jesus clubs full of Gentiles were dotted across Asia Minor and Greece. Rome also sported a community. Paul makes it very clear that the Jerusalem Club was the headquarters of the organisation. The Jerusalem Club was the epicentre of the earliest Christian community. That was led by James, the brother of Jesus, with the disciple Peter as his vacillating sidekick. They saw Jesus as the one come to save the Judeans, the Messiah. To be saved, they said, you first had to become a Jew and follow the Torah, the law. We do not know how many Jesus followers in the interwar time were converted pagans, and how many were Judeans, who thought that Jesus showed them the right way to live their religion. We do not know if some clubs contained both Gentiles and Judeans. The earliest Jesus clubs were charismatic communities, loosely united only by the occasional letter. We certainly know that Paul's letters circulated. How many others have been lost to time? The pre-war clubs made no attempt to construct a more coherent organisation. No such establishment was needed, for Jesus would return soon and end this world. The Great Revolt obliterated centuries-old Jewish social structures and rendered irrelevant long-standing practices such as sacrifice. The Christians had no social structures to extinguish, no bishops, no priests. The ancients held that from the start, the Jesus clubs were a united whole, whose ideas originated with and was spread by Jesus' disciples, and a few preachers such as Paul. Every Christian, they thought, was reading Mark and Matthew and Luke and Revelation, and the letters of Paul on their Roman Kindles. During the High Victorian era, New Testament scholars took a good hard look at the books of the New Testament. They decided that the earliest Jesus clubs were not a unified international love fest. Rather, the clubs were disconnected and disorganised. Clubs in Italy, for example, barely knew of the clubs in Greece or Syria or Judea, and had little idea of what they stood for. Paul's letter to the Romans implies as much. You can hear more about that in episode 2.56, Paul's third mission to the Corinthians and the Romans. Every club knew that some person called Eusus, from the obscure region of Judea had been raised from the dead. They had been told that his death somehow promised them a better life. Perhaps in this world, or perhaps in the next. That was all the clubs had in common. After the Great Revolt, the Jesus clubs began serious networking. The isolated fellowships were joyous to discover that others had heard the good news of Jesus. Some very literate people joined these networks, such as the authors of the Gospels, Acts and Revelation. If some of these authors were Aramaic speakers, they could afford to employ scribes to record their words in Greek. No book or letter in the New Testament betrays an Aramaic or Hebrew original. They were all written in Greek from the get-go. It's worth making a point about these authors and their scribes. They were exceptional people. Our best guess is that 15% of adult men and perhaps 2% of adult women in Roman towns and cities could read. In ancient Palestine, the number of literate adults was probably more like 3% of the population. Admittedly, these are just guesses, but you have to start somewhere. Perhaps half of these readers could also write. Reading is one talent. Learning how to compose proper sentences requires another level of skills. Quite possibly, few people outside the scribal profession and the very well-educated could write. In several of his letters, Paul tells us that he uses a scribe. But he also makes a point that some of the material is in his own hand. Paul was a member of the literate elite. A common guesstimate for the number of Christians in the world in the year 100, midway during the interwar period, is 8,000. We have solid evidence for the existence of 50 Jesus clubs. Let's double that to 100. So that gives about 80 people in each club. The Roman population was about 30% adult men and the same proportion of adult women. Each Jesus club would therefore have 2 or 3 men who could read and perhaps 1 woman. All the works of the earliest Christian authors, all the letters, all the Gospels, were directed to these literate members in each club. The once isolated clubs networked into larger communities in the decades after the Great Revolt. They began to firm up their notions of who Jesus was and what he meant. And they disagreed with each other. We don't know how many communities there were. Most scholars assume the communities were geographically close collections of Jesus clubs. An Egyptian community, a Syrian, an Italian. But it is entirely possible that the communities define themselves by other means. Perhaps Egyptian Christian merchants formed one community, and Egyptian Christian papyrus makers another. The Church Fathers believed that every book in the New Testament was addressed to and read by every community. That approach now is only favoured in conservative circles. It ignores the very real diversity and divisions of earliest Christianity. If the evangelists wrote for everyone, then why did Mark feel the need to explain Jewish customs to his audience? And why did Matthew, when he copied from Mark, omit Mark's explanations? Surely Mark and Matthew wrote for different audiences. Now let's move on past the time of the charismatic preachers and through the Great Revolt. I want to focus on the 2 earliest Christian communities, the Jewish one in Jerusalem, run by Peter and James, and a group of pagan foundations created by Paul. Writing 250 years after the event, the church historian Eusebius said that at the beginning of the Great Revolt, Jesus appeared to the Jerusalem club and warned them to run for their lives. The club purchased a discount group booking on the first donkey train out of Jerusalem. They ended up in the city of Pella, a week's ride northeast of Jerusalem, and just southeast of the Sea of Galilee. I have maps on my website. Pella was an excellent choice. The city was one of 10, the Decapolis, founded and populated by Greeks during the time of the Seleucid Kingdom, gone for 2 centuries. The Decapolis lay east of the Jordan River, beyond the ancient territory claimed by the Judeans, and outside the Roman prefecture of Judea. The Jerusalem Club could find hope and sanctuary amongst Gentiles, untouched by General Vespasian's depredations. This story is plausible, but only that. Eusebius may have woven a tale out of whole cloth to demonstrate the wickedness of the Judeans and the righteousness of the Christians. And as a foundation myth, it is a rather feeble one. The members of the Jerusalem Club, James and the disciples, were dismal proselytizers. James and Peter loom large in the book of Acts, but not even Acts can whitewash that they were missionary failures. Acts does not even pretend that the disciples accomplished anything worthwhile. It was left to much later authors to invent fables about the missionary adventures of the disciples, legends that circulate to this day. You can hear a roundup of these in my episode 2.59, The Fates of the Apostles. Had Christianity relied on James and the disciples, Christianity would be remembered, if at all, as an obscure Jewish cult and nothing more. Christianity found success amongst pagans, not the Jews. We see that as early as Paul. Paul's letters show a missionary who is continually rebuffed by Jewish communities and turns to Gentiles. In his letter to the Romans, Paul writes to a Jesus club he did not found and addresses them as Gentiles. In the same letter, he greets almost 30 believers in Jesus, only 6 of whom he calls Jews. Modern scholars believe that after the Great Revolt, the Jesus clubs were increasingly full of pagan supporters, not Jewish ones. They also think that the exclusive clubs, those with only Jews for Jesus supporters, rapidly diminished in number. Nonetheless, clubs of Jews for Jesus supporters persisted in the Mediterranean, and especially in Judea, until the Bar Kokhba revolt 2 generations later. Eusebius conducted some research on the matter. He discovered that from the Great Revolt until the Bar Kokhba revolt, all the leaders of the Jerusalem Club were Judeans, beginning with James. But after the revolt, all the leaders are Greeks. Eusebius recounts the rumour that these leaders were all actually members of Jesus' family, the desposunai, a Greek word meaning owned by the master. Eusebius is sceptical but not dismissive. Now, writing that intriguing possibility stumbles at the first fence. Who were these family members? In episode 2.41, Jesus' disciples, the other guys, I waded into the swamp of argument about the relationship between Jesus and those described as his adelphoi, brothers in New Testament Greek. Most Christians are vehement that Jesus had no brothers. His mother had only one child. Now, perhaps these people were half-siblings, children of Joseph, or cousins, children of Jesus' aunts and uncles, or even more distant relations. But New Testament Greek has many words for cousin, such as ex adelphos. If the Gospels had meant ex adelphos, then why do they not use that word? We'll never know. A few modern fringe scholars believe that these confusions were purposely planted in the Gospels to disguise the fact that the desposunai ran the Judean franchise for centuries. I don't understand either. Eusebius is keen to tell us that the Judean Jerusalem club founded by James was strictly legit. That stands in contrast to his castigation of other Judean Jesus clubs. Here we run into a terminological tempest that has had professors reaching for their brandy snifters the past decade. The term Jewish Christians has long been used to describe those Jesus clubs that adhered to Jewish law and practices. But this presumes that Judaism can be distinguished from Christianity in the period after the Great Revolt. It also assumes that the Judaizers are best understood as a sect of Christianity. Most scholars now accept that until at least the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132, it was very difficult to distinguish between Jews and Christians, until both developed institutions to enforce the distinction. So, rather than calling them Jewish Christians, I'll use phrases like Judean Jesus fans. The Church Fathers were muddled about these fans. After we dug up Gnostic documents in the early 20th century, it became clear that the Fathers were very ill-informed about the Gnostics. And if the Fathers were ill-informed about the Gnostics, they were likely confused about the Judean Jesus fan clubs. Unfortunately, we have no ancient documents written by the Judean Jesus fan clubs. We only have quotations preserved by the Fathers. Some of these quotations refer to a gospel according to the Hebrews. Scholars now think that there were one or two other gospels. I'll get to them in later episodes. The gospel according to the Hebrews was probably written around the same time as our later three gospels. Call it the year 100. Many scholars consider the title to be another name for the book called the Gospel of the Nazareans. For many decades, the Gospel was a contender to join the New Testament canon. The Gospel was very similar to our canonical Gospels. According to the Fathers, the Gospel of the Hebrews was just a little shorter than the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of the Hebrews was a weighty work. Writing about the year 400, long after Christianity had been legalized, the Church Father Jerome thought that the Gospel of the Hebrews was the Hebrew or Aramaic original of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, like all our New Testament books, Matthew is written in Greek. Matthew is both the most Jewish and anti-Jewish of the Gospels. I discussed the Gospel extensively in episode 2.29, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Certainly, the Gospel of the Hebrews describes a community that considers itself thoroughly Jewish. Jerome declared that he found Nazarene Christians in Syria using the Gospel. Few modern scholars believe that the Gospel of the Hebrews was the original of Matthew. Matthew's Greek just does not read as a translation from another language. And there is this passage. According to Jerome, the Gospel of the Hebrews says this, quote, "After the Lord had risen, he went to James and appeared to him. For James had sworn that he would not eat bread from the hour when he had drunk the Lord's cup, until he should see him risen again from among those that sleep. The Lord said, 'Bring a table and bread.' He took bread and blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to James the just, and said to him, 'My brother, eat your bread, for the Son of Man is risen from among those that sleep.'" End quote. Now, James does not appear in our four Gospels. The Gospel of the Hebrews rectifies that by establishing a bond between James and Jesus. Just as Jesus had sworn not to drink of the fruit of the vine until he drank it in the new kingdom, so James takes a similar oath. Putting together what little we know, The Gospel according to the Hebrews may have been written, or at least used, by the descendants of the Jerusalem Jesus Club. Perhaps the club fled to Pella, perhaps not. As Acts tells us, before the Great Revolt, the club's members were known as Nazarenes by their fellow Judeans, and so they were remembered by later fathers. The Gospel of the Hebrews was popular amongst Greek-speaking Jewish Jesus clubs in Egypt. The Gospel, alas, was already fading from view in Jerome's time. A decade after the death of Jesus, the Jerusalem Club was aghast to discover that a fellow Jew called Saul was proselytizing about Jesus to pagans. Wait. What? Jesus came for the Jews. Saul, they thought, was appalling. He certainly had a mighty opinion of himself. Paul had the audacity to cite the prophets Isaiah and Zechariah, that he would be the light unto nations. As Paul wrote to the club he founded in Galatia. Quote, Galatians 1:15. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born, and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. End quote. Worse than that, Saul said he knew Jesus as well as the disciples did, even though Saul had never met Jesus in the flesh. Saul claimed that Jesus had appeared to him years after Jesus died, and gave him a secret revelation. Saul evangelized that anyone could be saved, and they certainly did not have to follow the Torah. To call Jesus the Jewish Messiah was petty. That Messiah would only liberate Judeans from the Roman yoke. That was nothing. Jesus' death, Saul said, redeemed all of humanity. Jesus was a divine cosmic figure, not some pious Jewish sage turned warrior. The book of Acts is very clear that the Jerusalem Club was deeply suspicious of this newcomer. Acts makes a big deal of Paul as he became known, but barely mentions other Gentile proselytizers. We know for certain that there were others, since Paul did not found the Jesus Club in Rome. Did Acts use Paul as a proxy for all Gentile missionaries? Perhaps Paul was the best known to Luke, the author of Acts. Or perhaps Paul was simply the most prominent missionary out there. Finally, I'd like to finish this episode by comparing the teachings of Jesus and Paul. In many ways they were alike. Both were born and raised as pious Jews. The core of both their teachings was the need for faith and the love of one's neighbours as the fulfilment of the law. Neither Jesus nor Paul had any truck with the Pharisees, who argued that the right way to achieve right standing before God was to scrupulously follow the law. Paul explicitly rejected the notion. Jesus implicitly did so in his many confrontations with the Pharisees. Both were influenced by the centuries-old Jewish tradition of apocalyptic thought. This understood that the world was ruled by forces of evil, but God would destroy these powers in battles both heavenly and earthly. And these cosmic battles would be fought soon in their own lifetimes. Jesus and Paul also had profound differences. For a start, the two had different attitudes to the religion they were born in. Jesus was a good Jew who believed he had come to turn Israel's heart back to God and prepare God's people for the coming of God's kingly rule. He certainly had no intention of founding a new religion. There was no other religion. Jesus knew that there was only one religion for his people, the worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Paul believed that the God of Israel was the God of all humanity, not just the Jews. He argued that Gentiles could join the Jews in the kingdom to come. To do so, the pagans had to embrace Yahweh as the one and only God and reject all others as vain idols. The Gospels are very ambiguous about the coming cosmic judge, the one to appear in the clouds of heaven and try the world. As I discussed in episode 2.48, do you think you're what they say you are? Jesus thinks that this cosmic judge will be someone other than himself, someone he calls the Son of Man. Paul is certain. The great judge is Jesus himself. Jesus believed his role in the world was to proclaim the coming of God's kingly rule and teach his people the right understanding of the law. Paul quotes Jesus' teaching a scant 3 times in all his letters. Paul is ignorant of Jesus' biography. Paul does not know that Jesus was a preacher and a healer. To Paul, Jesus' life is irrelevant. Only his death is imperative. Jesus believed the Jews could escape the wrath of the celestial judge by adopting his interpretation of the Jewish law. Paul taught that the only escape for humanity was to believe in the salvational power of the death and resurrection of Jesus. When Jesus talked of faith, he meant trusting the good Father God to soon bring about a righteous kingly rule on earth. When Paul spoke of faith, he meant the conviction that the resurrection of Jesus was a world-changing event. Paul turned the message of Jesus into a message about Jesus. And finally, Jesus taught that the Jews could begin their lives in God's kingly rule right now, by accepting Jesus' teachings right now. Paul taught that anyone could do that, only if they died with Christ to overcome sin. And they did that by accepting baptism. In the next episode, I investigate how the earliest Christian communities struggled to decipher Jesus. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.